Perfect. Perfect.
The year is 2004. The United Nations declares 2004 as an International Year of Rice. The Vaporwave Awards bestow Duke Nukem Forever with a Lifetime Achievement Award, not because the game was a groundbreaking release, but because it was announced in the late 90s and wouldn't hit store shelves until 2011.
Look at my ass. Do it now.
But most gamers fondly remember that year for the impeccable lineup of games. But no game would convince more people to call in sick for work with a fabricated case of influenza like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas did. Now, despite how immaculate this game is in every sense of the word, it has some excruciatingly tedious missions that you'll have to play through in order to experience the game's story in its entirety. We're talking RC planes that are as easy to control as puppeteering a dummy with nothing but your pinky toe and the grace of God. Hightailing after a train with a motorcycle and a passenger whose aim is about as accurate as a narcoleptic adult film star. And, case in point, the mission Mad Dog's Rhymes. In it, CJ is so fed up with aspiring rapper OG Loke and his utterly abysmal rhymes, so instead of ghostwriting, he instead opts for taking it 2 steps further, and purloining someone else's work. So it's off to esteemed rapper Mad Dog's mansion to swipe his rhyme book and successfully return it to OG Loke. However, there's a problem. Instead of the tried and true guns blazing approach that you've been accustomed to at this point in the game, this mission incentivizes a more covert and stealthy approach. While the novelty of a stealth mission is commendable in a Grand Theft Auto game, it's the inclusion itself that ultimately undermines its quality. Because for as incredible of a studio Rockstar Games is, with the exception of Manhunt, stealth was never their forte. You'll be forced into using a serviceable yet extremely clunky and half-baked stealth system that feels like it was implemented into the game for the sake of novelty as opposed to functionality. Thankfully, after snatching the rhyme book, you're able to clean house with a guns blazing approach if you want to, but by this point, the damage has already been done, and the underwhelming reward of respect points and the aforementioned combat knife was the final nail in the coffin. This is what I'm talking about today, awful stealth sections in games that are otherwise not primarily centered around stealth. Enjoy! So, the Legend of Zelda series has always revolved around the idea of changing up the formula, as a bulk of the mainline entries take place in a myriad of alternate timelines and eras. However, there's one game in the series that was quite notorious among the player base for its radically distinct art style. That game being The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. For as acclaimed as this game was upon its release, the player base had a massive issue with acclimating to the game's cel-shaded art design, and unfortunately, it caused the game to have rather underwhelming sales figures as a result. Well, comparatively underwhelming. 4 million copies is nothing to scoff at, but Nintendo really wanted that money. However, it also probably didn't help that the game decided to opt for a stealth-oriented segment in one of the first areas you encounter post-Outset Island, the Forsaken Fortress. After his sister is swiped up by a giant bird, Link sets course for the Forsaken Fortress, and he's gonna need Tetra, her pirate ship, and her ragtag group of pirates in order to get there. Sounds like a kick-ass swashbuckling adventure, full of peril, clashing swords, and enough sea shanties and spiked milk to lead to a rum-induced orgy, right? Well, you know this game's made by Nintendo, and you saw the title of the video. What do you think? Upon reaching the Forsaken Fortress, Tetra conjures up the brilliant idea of strapping Link to a catapult and hurling him towards the fortress. Fellas, if this happens to you, you've either just been rejected by a woman from the medieval ages, or the lady that you're interested in is just playing hard to get. However, long-ranged accuracy was never Tetra's strong suit, so instead of a gracefully noble landing followed by manic shrieking and a merciless killing spree, Link collides with the fortress face first and loses grip of his sword in the process. As a result, Link is left with nothing more than his shield as a means of self-defense. Consequently, this means that he has to resort to skulking in the shadows, and hiding in plain sight in one of the most asinine disguises imaginable, a wooden barrel. In most circumstances, you wouldn't last 2 steps without getting sent careening down a steep mountainside, or getting snatched up by a group of raging alcoholics in search of a new keg. Thankfully, the guards exhibit the same degree of intelligence as the average human in a pre-discovery of fire era. In order to circumvent the enemy forces, you'll have to perform an eclectic array of stealthy maneuvers, ranging from avoiding the abundance of searchlights to embracing your inner ligneous storage vessel and hiding in the aforementioned barrel. You have to exercise a little extra caution too, because the guards can range from laughably oblivious to your presence to hyper-vigilant in the blink of an eye. In other words, this one's been guarding the place for 4 days straight, and this one mistook the crystal meth for rock candy. But that right there exemplifies one of my biggest gripes with the Forsaken Fortress. It serves as the first dungeon of the entire game, the pivotal moment where you part ways with your convivial island, and the defining segment in which the game unscrews the training wheels and leads you to your own devices. So let me ask you this. Why in the fresh Hyrulean fuck is this a stealth section? Now, up to this point, my experience with the Forsaken Fortress was tedious and cumbersome, but relatively undemanding, all things considered. And then, there I am, on the precipice of liberation. I'm mere moments away from recovering mastering my sword, and turning this fortress into a makeshift slaughterhouse after my homicidal tendencies have been pushed to the limit. And as if some divine being gazed down upon my circumstances and decided to play a twisted practical joke, I learned the hard way that I missed a few steps. See, not only do you have to maneuver around the enemy forces, but you also have to go out of your way to disable all 3 of the spotlights scattered throughout the area. While smacking the light-operating bokoblins with nearby wooden clubs is admittedly cathartic, it doesn't compensate for the monotony and the tedium that I just had to endure moments prior. And as the cherry on top of this cake composed of fecal matter and disappointment, when you finally manage to recover your sword and attempt to free your sister from her confines, Link is briskly clamped between the talons of the aforementioned bird, and tossed into the distance like the mentally brave yet structurally feeble sack of shit that he is, rendering this entire segment as completely fruitless. Thankfully, it's at this point where you meet the King of Red Lions, and are able to continue your journey without having to intermittently stop and go like it's a congested highway. Now, what I find interesting is that you actually return to the Forsaken Fortress on 2 subsequent occasions, but the game surprisingly makes those sections far more engaging and, well, fun. Simple as that. Subsequent entries would attempt to integrate stealth in a more palatable fashion with some fairly mixed results, but the Forsaken Fortress has withstood the test of time as one of the all-time weakest stealth segments in the entire series. Uncharted, a series rife with climactic action set pieces, intense gunfights, and a fantastic sense of pacing. It's no wonder the series is as acclaimed and widely revered as it is. Now, while every Uncharted game has its fair share of ardent supporters, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves is the one that most fans consider the apex of the series. Personally, I'm more of an Uncharted 4 kind of guy, but even I can admit that Uncharted 2 is still an undisputed masterpiece in every sense of the word. Now, given the game's ramped up budget compared to the prior entry, Uncharted 2 integrated a myriad of new ideas into its core gameplay while still keeping the spirit of the previous game intact. This means more visually striking scenery, a more diverse and eclectic array of environments, and a far more lofty sense of scale and ambition. A prime example goes to the opening segment of the game, which sees Nathan Drake clinging for dear life on a boxcar dangling over the edge of a mountain drenched in thick layers of snow. Honestly, it's kind of impressive that Drake is capable of such profound acts of dexterity. Meanwhile, I buy a stress gripper to make my fingers a little more practical, and I still have yet to please my girlfriend. It's one of the most iconic and exemplary openings in video game history, but the segment that takes place immediately afterwards is quite the stark opposite. See, after managing to escape the train, the game intermittently dials back the clock, so to speak, and gives you a bit of context as to how Drake ended up in this perilous position, which in turn leads to the second chapter of the game breaking and entering.
Don't you love the way the water makes your jeans all squidgy?
Boy, if you don't...
In this chapter, Drake teams up with Chloe Fraser and Harry Flynn, and ventures out to Istanbul in order to snatch up a Mongolian lamp that's linked to Marco Polo. And I know what some of you were thinking, but no, this is not the game where Drake dons his wetsuit. We're talking about the Explorer, not the pool-associated recreational activity. For the less historically savvy, though, don't worry, Drake's got you covered.
Hey, check it out. Marco.
Really?
Come on.
No.
Marco.
Hello.
Just goes to show you how conniving Chloe is. She's not even in the pool, that cheating bitch. However, the traditional method of recklessly fire your gun and lob an entire arsenal's worth of grenades isn't gonna cut it, because instead, the crew has to exercise a more cloak and dagger approach, by entering a museum from underneath the sewers in order to snag the artifact. Sounds simple, right? Well, here's the problem. Much like any prestigious fictional museum, this one is flooded with armed guards and an elaborate alarm system. So if you want to make it in and out in one piece, you're gonna have to exercise a great deal of patience. At first, it's actually a fairly enjoyable level. You'll be shimmying up and down pipes, engaging in some lighthearted banter with Harry, uncovering some hidden treasure. It's all good stuff. But then, you manage to make it out of the sewers and into the museum, and then you and Harry are able to coordinate a stealth attack on an unsuspecting guard. What should be a tense yet ultimately enjoyable addition to the gameplay instead serves as an omen of the aggravation that you're about to endure. So after giving this guy a disciplinary smack on the head and letting him contemplate his line of work, you'll see the tower containing the artifact off in the distance. But there's a problem. The only way to get there is from the roof, and look, Drake has some immense talent when it comes to vaulting towards ledges. I'm not gonna deny that. But a superhuman, he is not. So so that means you're gonna have to make it there through a second courtyard located next to the nearby gate. But of course, it's not exactly in the most convenient location, and this right here marks the pivotal moment in which this segment evolves from enjoyable to vexatious in a snap. So first things first, the enemies in this level don't exhibit any icon or indicator that indicates whether they've seen you or not. This isn't a requirement per se, but this means that there will be instances in which you'll be turning a corner, minding your own business, probably humming a little theme song in your head, and all of a sudden, a soldier who seemingly materialized out of thin air will start blowing his whistle at you like he's conducting traffic, leading to you surrendering and restarting at the most recent checkpoint. The game tried to give you a little leeway by giving the player a roughly 3-second window of time for you to take down the guard before he blows the whistle, but there's another problem. See, at this point, you're still acclimating to the control scheme, you're still learning how to maneuver around corners, and you're still attempting to grasp the stealth mechanics, so chances are the scenario that plays out involves you frantically rolling, unintentionally snapping to the nearby corner, and then scrambling to dash towards the enemy only to succumb to the error of your ways. It's a massive pain in the ass, but that's not even the most notorious section of this level. After opening the nearby gate, you'll stumble across a segment of the museum that proudly displays a fountain. This fucking fountain was the bane of my existence back in the day, as the guards are scattered throughout the area like Turkish cockroaches, and given the aforementioned lack of a visibility indicator, this section was even more of a hectic clusterfuck than the one mentioned earlier. But then, you're bestowed with a tranquilizer gun, which should be a beacon of hope. But this section is also pretty galling, because the gun has the range and accuracy of an inebriated sniper with a cactus lodged firmly up his rectum. Sometimes you'll aim for the head, pull the trigger, and watch in astonishment as the dart soars past the opponent's head. Other times, you'll land the shot while aiming at a nearby wall. But most times, you'll fire, you'll miss, you'll have an internal panic attack, you'll fire again, and by then, both your cover and your pride are completely compromised in the process. Fortunately, you'll eventually uncover the relic, but unfortunately, you'll also get double-crossed by Harry and left in the dust. But thankfully, from this point onwards, the rest of the experience is just about flawless. Mandatory stealth sections were practically non-existent in Uncharted 3, minus a tailing section or two. Stealth would be largely overhauled in Uncharted 4, making it a far more viable option if you wanted to take that kind of approach to enemies, and given that Naughty Dog fleshed out stealth even more so in both of the Last of Us games, it seems like their days of botched stealth sections are a thing of the past. The Incredible Hulk. He's one of pop culture's greatest superheroes, the physical personification of roid rage, and the de facto illustration of how green visually harmonizes with purple. For all of his strengths, however, Hulk has unfortunately been given the short end of the stick when it comes to his portrayals in the world of video games. With some exceptions, of course. Let me just ask you guys something real quick. Why does Hulk feel so damn flimsy in a shocking amount of video games? I mean, sure, a handful of games successfully immersed you into the destructive side of the titular character, with the most prominent example being that of Hulk Ultimate Destruction. This game is awesome. Fun fact, this game was made by the same developers that would go on to conceive the Prototype series, hence why both feel extremely familiar gameplay-wise. The only difference between Hulk and Alex Mercer is that the former doesn't blast My Chemical Romance through his headphones, and doesn't claim to be a savant of the guitar when his sweep-picking technique looks like this. But then you have games like Marvel's Avengers, which somehow bastardizes Hulk and makes him just about as effective to enemies as my fists are to a brick wall. Yeah, remember my finger issues? I wasn't joking. But one of the most baffling decisions when it came to adapting the character in a video game came in the form of 2003's Hulk, released as a tie-in game to the film of the same name. Double fun fact, this was also made by the same developers as Prototype, which solidifies my belief that these guys just need to be commissioned to make another current-gen Hulk game. I thoroughly enjoy this game. It's not quite on the same pedestal as Ultimate Destruction, but hey, as a competent beat-em-up that's made to coincide with a pre-MCU Hulk movie, pretty solid for what it is, all things considered. That being said, many critics and fans unanimously criticized one particular aspect of the game that ultimately hindered its true potential: the stealth sections. Throughout the course of the game, you'll consistently bounce between two core gameplay styles: the beat-em-up gameplay, which is quite fitting for a Hulk game, and the stealth gameplay, in which you don't play as the Hulk, but instead as Bruce Banner. Yes, you heard that right. A Hulk game with stealth sections. That being said, I didn't want to judge the stealth mechanic based off of pure concept, because as absurd as it sounds given the context of the fact that it's in a Hulk game, it could work if implemented correctly and given some pizzazz. The problem is that, while it's serviceable and surprisingly functional, it's also excruciatingly tedious, painfully milquetoast, and unjustifiably prolonged. While the stealth sections themselves are peppered throughout the game, the most egregious example has to go to the level Infiltration. So to kick things off, Bruce finds himself in a facility in Alcatraz, with the primary goal of swiping the coveted Gamma Orb from Ravage, I don't know how to say his name. For context, the Gamma Orb is capable of extracting the very same gamma energy that created the Hulk in the first place. Yes, I read up on the lore for the Hulk video game based on the 2003 movie that takes place after said movie. Look, after I found out that Coolsville existed prior to the James Gunn movies, I've started becoming a little extra pedantic ever since. However, there's a catch. Instead of morphing into the Hulk, channeling your inner Limp Bizkit enthusiast circa Woodstock 99, and ravaging every object and sentient being in sight, the game says that you're unable to do so because someone is being held hostage. Instead, you'll be constrained into lurking in the shadows, frantically dashing away at the onset of conflict and warmly embracing your enemies around the neck when they least expect it. And would you look at that? They're so overwhelmed with comfort and emotional support that they have no other choice but to slump to the ground in defeat. How wholesome, how emotional, how erotic. First things first, you'll have to discreetly maneuver behind these two trucks that look akin to an untextured vehicle model. Clearly, the team in charge of the art direction was shafted when it came to allocating the budget. Then, after patiently waiting for the nearby guards to waltz past you, you then have to make a mad dash for the nearby gate and, oh, would you look at that? Everyone's favorite video game trope. The conveniently placed wooden crate that serves as an extra platform for you to hop off of and move around. Clearly, this game spoke to me. I've always wanted to emulate the typical day-to-day movements of an underpaid factory worker. Then after that, you'll have to delicately sneak past these three hairless mutant dogs that resemble a hybrid of a mole rat from Fallout and Tommy Lee's primordial scrotum. And then, finally, you're able to swing the odds in your favor by yanking down this lever and disabling the searchlights. Well, some of them at least, but not all of them, because fuck me, am I right? Now, if you do end up getting caught by a guard, you do technically have a means of defense, but the problem is that Bruce's damage output is so pathetically minuscule that it'll take you 2.5 business days in order to drain an enemy's health bar. Well, that is if they don't get their hands on you first, because Bruce has the brawn of a wet noodle and takes bullets to the abdomen like they're cannonballs. Must have been a theater kid. But the worst part of the level is that it just drags on and on. Right when you think you've hit the climax of the level, guess what, asshole? You're not even close to being finished. And you still got more boxes to shove and even more levers to switch off, and a laboratory section to trudge through. What's even worse is that if you know what you're doing, you could complete this level in roughly 10 to 15 minutes, but given the sizable amount of prerequisites that you'll need to accomplish in order to get there, it feels more like 30 minutes or an hour. After cracking a couple of passcodes, Bruce is then able to transform back into the Hulk and wreak havoc in the following level. But did he really need to spend 10 minutes LARPing as a gangly armed Solid Snake? I don't think so. Okay, so we're not quite done talking about fumbled stealth sections in superhero games because now we're gonna talk about a rather infamous example, or should I say, series of examples, in the contemporary gaming landscape: the Mary Jane stealth segments in Marvel's Spider-Man. This is an incredible game. No joke, one of the greatest superhero games to ever hit store shelves, as it perfectly encapsulated the heart, humor, and high-octane action present in a typical Spider-Man story. And for a game to stand this tall in the highly competitive field of 2018's game releases, yeah, that's a monumental achievement alone. Now, this game also gave Spider-Man a rather fleshed out stealth system, at least compared to prior Spider-Man titles, and honestly, yeah, it's pretty solid for what it is. It feels great to zip from pole to pole and spin unsuspecting enemies into webs. Now, that being said, it feels like Insomniac wanted to give players their money's worth, at least when it comes to the quantity of playable characters, because roughly halfway through the game's story, players get to take control of Peter Parker's love interest, Mary Jane Watson. You might recall in a previous video of mine that I actually enjoyed the stealth sections of Spider-Man 2, due to how absurdly powerful MJ is in that game. And yeah, that opinion still rings true for me. But in that same video, I was also fairly charitable to the Mary Jane stealth sections in Spider-Man 1, and I downplayed just how jarring and out of place they felt compared to the rest of the game. Yeah, I take that back. Now, I was initially planning on consolidating all of the sections into one entry, but personally, I just didn't feel like that would be warranted, because there's one stealth section that sticks out like a sore thumb. The very first one in the mission Dinner Date. So prior to this mission, Peter gets a call from MJ, and at first glance, this seems like it's gonna be a wholesome cutscene mission. Spider-Man 2018 has a handful of these. As the title implies, Peter and MJ are gonna have a much-needed dinner date. But hey, you never know, things might escalate a bit. They might jump to dessert if you catch my drift. I heard MJ likes nerds and Peter likes red velvet cake. But instead of a romantic candlelight dinner, MJ instead informs Peter of a mysterious warehouse that she infiltrated earlier in the day. Instead of a snappy cutscene that visualizes what happened, the game opts for putting you in the shoes of Mary Jane herself. And if you couldn't guess, she lacks the superhuman characteristics of Spider-Man, so you know what that means. You're stripped of the web-slinging action that you've grown accustomed to, and are instead confined to partake in the first of many stealth sections. First things first, remember how I mentioned earlier that Mary Jane in Spider-Man 2 was actually pretty damn proficient at self-defense, which led to her being overpowered? Well, this was before then, and as a result, you have no means of defense, meaning that the environment is your best ally in this scenario. You'll see yourself shoving over the nearby equipment in order to distract guards and sneak around them, which isn't a bad idea on paper, but the enemies react to this with about as much urgency as me after a night of hard liquor and questionable choices. If this were a Bethesda game, that guard would have probably chalked it up to the wind, or maybe an air conditioning unit if you want to get all contemporary. Trudge a little further, and you'll then be introduced to boxes and shards of glass that can potentially disclose your location to the nearby guards. Oh, and speaking of those guards, the lack of proper lighting means that you'll inadvertently place yourself in their line of sight because they were blending in with the nearby shadows. And if you are spotted, you'll have what feels like a half-second window of time to evade the enemy's line of sight, because they lack the audio reaction time, but God forbid they see a redhead, it'll be Salem all over again. Now, I will be a bit generous and say that this is one of the shorter MJ stealth sections in the game, but in the subsequent segments, you're at least given an audio distraction device and a taser to lure and dispatch enemies with, so it's at least marginally more enjoyable. Thankfully, the section culminates with an admittedly fantastic introduction of Tombstone in all of his formidable and ominous glory, but still, this could have easily been a brief cutscene instead of a full-fledged stealth section. To this day, the MJ stealth sections are remembered as a blemish on an otherwise excellent outing from Insomniac, but look, I'll tell you right now, it takes some massive guts to take a widely lambasted mechanic and reintegrate it in the sequel and improve upon it in almost every conceivable fashion. They're still not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but good God, compare them to the first game's stealth sections, and it feels like you're playing Splinter Cell. Oh man, The Order 1886. Do any of you guys remember this game? I almost didn't until I started doing some research for the video. So The Order 1886 was a breathtaking display of the capabilities of the PlayStation 4, as its art direction and graphics were lauded as some of the most impressive that the industry had to offer. Hell, I'd argue that to this day, The Order 1886 is still a visually striking experience from beginning to end. So why don't people talk about this game anymore? Well, I'll tell you why. Because that aforementioned graphical fidelity was one of the only things that sold this game. Everything else was just kind of stock standard. It's like the 2015 equivalent of the Callisto Protocol, but at least The Order didn't make me want to drag my thumbs across a cheese grater. Now, for some peculiar reason, this game has an odd fixation on QuickTime events. Maybe not to the same degree as Resident Evil 4 or Kingdom Hearts 2, but still notable nonetheless. The difference in those games, however, is that it often felt like the QuickTime events supplemented the gameplay, and were used frequently enough to keep you on your feet. In this game, though, the QTEs just feel like they're shoehorned in, or were implemented as a result of either a dwindling budget or a severe lack of compelling ideas. But the most egregious example comes in the form of the level Brothers in Arms. So in this level, both Lucan and Galahad are tasked with sneaking into a trading company's headquarters in order to get some dirt on them, while also having the most 1800s-esque British names that you could ever imagine. Things start a little bit more on the tranquil side, as you'll inspect some nearby evidence and eventually stumble across a conveniently placed crossbow, because apparently the security in 1800s London was just as abysmal as the dentistry. Afterwards, you'll rendezvous with Lucan on the rooftop, and after scouting out the area, you'll zipline onto the battleground. And after such a fucking awesome entrance, you would think that this would culminate in a hectic gunfight, but no, not at all. After landing, Galahad ducks for cover and patiently waits as a nearby guard investigates the noise. Okay, fine. A stealth section. I'll bite. I'll assume that it's the stock standard to press the button to stealth kill technique.
What the fuck is this?
So get this, instead of just, pressing the triangle button to initiate a stealth kill, you are instead forced into engaging in a QuickTime event in order to successfully incapacitate the guard. I think conceptually the idea isn't terrible. I mean, Manhunt did a pretty damn good job at emphasizing the timing of your stealth kills. The difference here is that it feels contrived and awkward to pull off, and you're essentially only given one highly specific method of dispatching your enemies. Press the button too early, you fail. Press it too late, you fail. Get spotted by the enemy and you're invited to tea and crumpets as you discuss your grievances in a civil manner. No, you fucking lose. You're able to shake up the gameplay a little bit by killing off enemies with your crossbow, but the problem there is that you're given a very limited amount of ammunition. So you'll shoot a couple of enemies, realize you've emptied your crossbow bolts, and you'll then have to relegate yourself to knife duties. Well, that is if you can successfully land your crossbow shots in the first place. Sometimes it's dead accurate, other times it feels like the scope was attached with chewed up gum and cheap liquid glue. And sometimes the camera will be your worst enemy in this level. Because of how it's positioned, you might just casually stroll control into an enemy's flashlight and be met with the same amount of hostility as a middle-aged soccer mom to a fast food employee. And unlike Spider-Man or Uncharted, you're not given a brief window of time to react accordingly, or at least prevent yourself from getting Old Yellard without the barn to be escorted behind for a more dignified death. And then, after all of that, you're engaged in a couple of shootouts, some more gorgeous scenery that I'm sure was just an excuse for the visual department to fondle themselves while charging you $60 for it, and a climactic fight against a handful of Lycan. Well, I say climactic, but the developers miraculously made an encounter with a werewolf-adjacent creature less engaging and stress-inducing than a handful of vigilant guards. Oh, and did I mention that they came jam-packed with even more quick-time events? And lastly, we're talking about one of the more obscure examples, Day 72 from Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days. Holy fuck, that was a mouthful. Look, I adore the Kingdom Hearts series. I love Disney, I love Final Fantasy, and much like peanut butter and chocolate, they weave together shockingly well. But my god, there are some downright infuriating levels in the series. Most think of Deep Jungle from Kingdom Hearts 1, with its clunky platforming and homogeneous level design. But I actually have to disagree. That level's grown on me like a fungus protruding out of my toenail. As I initially hated it, then I tolerated it, and now I have a newfound respect for it. Unlike the fungus, however, I didn't name it, and I don't talk to it whenever I start getting lonely. Or, if you're like me, you might despise Wonderland, also from Kingdom Hearts 1, with its gratuitously convoluted structure and an aimless scavenger hunt that culminates in the exact same fashion every single time, regardless of how many evidence boxes you get. I even talked about it in a video, go check it out. And don't even get me started on Atlantica from Kingdom Hearts 2. My mom walked in on me playing this segment once, and I had to tell her that I was watching a filler episode on a Disney-themed anime because it was easier to explain. But there's one relatively obscure level that lives in infamy in a small subset of the Kingdom Hearts fan base, but it's not from a mainline entry, believe it or not. This is Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days. It's one of the handful of entries designed specifically with handheld consoles in mind, hence why it isn't quite as thoroughly discussed as other more integral entries in the series. That being said, I like this game. The control scheme makes me want to skip my decennial tetanus shot and slam my foot on a rusty nail, but besides that, it's all relatively smooth sailing. See, instead of the traditional level layout, which generally sees you exploring a world and progressing through its story, this game emphasizes a briskly paced mission-by-mission structure, often recycling the same environments by bestowing you with different tasks to accomplish. This can range from defeating a certain number of enemies, to finding all the chests in a given area, to investigating for clues, to even something as mind-bogglingly peculiar as stalking a target. On Day 72, you'll see yourself immersed in the marketplace of Agrabah from the film Aladdin. Although Aladdin is just one of a handful of Disney films present in the game, it has the distinction of housing a particularly frustrating stealth tailing section. Roxas and Axel are sent out to Agrabah in order to slay the inhabiting Heartless, and collect some hearts in the process like a boy band on a concert tour. However, they'll eventually uncover Pete of all villains scouring through the marketplace in search of something, we don't know yet. But if I had to take a stab in the dark, I'd say it's probably something innocuous like Arabian pottery or maybe some food. Little does he know that he doesn't have to worry about the latter with all that cake he's been packing. Regardless, it's time to cut his vacation short, but you can't just face him head on. Instead, you're gonna have to stealthily tail the guy, because when I think of Kingdom Hearts, I also think of methodically stalking my prey before going in for the strike like every other action RPG. Firstly, you'll notice that both Roxas and Pete have color-coded vision cones that indicate their line of sight. Now, when you first see this, you start to wonder, why do both characters need a manifested cone of vision? Here's the answer. Not only do you have to successfully evade Pete's line of sight, but you also have to make sure that he stays in your vision cone. Now, I know what you're thinking, C-Shift, why is this game in particular committing such a cardinal sin when other games do the exact same thing? It's not like tailing missions were exactly a novelty when this game released. Well, unlike, say, Assassin's Creed, a series brimming with nauseating tailing missions, this game doesn't give you the tools necessary for you to properly tackle the objective. But then again, Assassin's Creed isn't exactly consistent with this either. Fuck the ship sections. In Assassin's Creed, you're able to blend in with your surroundings, using crowds of civilians as makeshift camouflage and bales of hay as hiding spaces. Not to mention the parkour system that allows you to shimmy up rooftops and stalk your enemies from an elevated location. This game, however, was not built with stealth capabilities in mind, and as a result, you get this obscenely clunky and dreadful stealth mechanic that, more often than not, sees you periodically tapping yourself forward in order to follow Pete. Get too close and he'll spot you, but get too distanced and you'll fail the encounter. You have to hit this damn near flawless sweet spot in order to successfully tail the guy. And also, let me remind you that this game is played on a Nintendo DS. This thing lacks the convenience of an analog stick, meaning that you'll have to drag your thumb across the D-pad and pray for the love of all things good and holy that you don't develop a blister. And if that wasn't wasn't bad enough, you might also recall that the DS lacks a button or an additional D-pad dedicated to controlling the camera. So guess what? If Pete decides that he wants to make a hard pivot in the opposite direction, you'll have to quickly move yourself out of his sight, then awkwardly turn around and hone in on him because the radar cone is tied to the direction that you're facing. If you don't swing your body around and face him in a quick enough fashion, while simultaneously obscuring yourself from his line of sight, it's game over. And you'll be circling back to this screen incessantly like it's a fucked up repetitive fever dream. I've seen the argument that this section becomes more straightforward after learning Pete's walking patterns, and hey, touche, I'll give you that. But when you have a poorly implemented stealth system and controls that make me want to chain smoke next to an oil reserve, is it really worth the hassle? After enduring all of that, you'll eventually trail Pete through the desert, thankfully in the form of a cutscene. Spider-Man, take notes. And you'll eventually be able to explore the Cave of Wonders and finish the mission with a bang. Thankfully, after this point, you'll be able to venture out into other Disney worlds. And you know what? I'm actually really starting to enjoy this game. No more tedium, no more haphazardly conceived stealth sections, no more bullshit. No, that's not possible. I'm hallucinating. Are you fucking kidding me?